Now that you have a general understanding of color theory and have practiced your color theory knowledge by creating a color wheel using red, yellow, and blue, you already know how to make the secondaries and tertiaries. We also know that we can lighten a color by adding white to give it a tint, or darken a color by adding black to give it a shade. And we've also talked about how to make brown or even dull a color by adding a color's complement. It's a little bit harder to make specialty colors, and the best way you can do that is to just kind of stumble through and try your best to mix and match over and over again until you get the correct color. So we're going to be working on a series of swatches that we're going to find in magazines. Your goal is to find specialty colors that aren't pure red, yellow, and blue, so you know that there's going to be a bit of mixing in them. And then we're going to use paint to try to stumble our way through getting the exact match. You can see I've already done 4 colors on this sheet where I tried to closely match the little magazine swatches that I put on my paper. This is not something that's easy to do. It might take you numerous times or many minutes just to make one color, and that's why it's important to constantly have a scrap paper near you so you can keep mixing and matching, and holding your colors that you make up to the swatches that are on the paper. Never settle for it being close. We learn by doing, and we learn by experimenting. So if it doesn't closely match, you just need to figure out what colors you need to add just to slightly tweak your color so that it matches the swatch. Now you're going to be mixing your paints in a palette that's going to allow you to continuously change the colors as needed, and then of course testing them on scrap paper. And it's pretty important that when you're trying to do something like this, you're using a paint type that has white in it. So thicker paints that are a little more saturated, things like acrylic paint, tempera paint, even gouache, those are better sets to use instead of something like watercolor paint, which often doesn't even have white in it. You rely on lightening the color in order for the paper to show through. So our goal is to make nice saturated colors to try to match the colors today. For that reason, we're going to use tempera cakes for their ease of cleanup and just their thickness and your ability to make a nice saturated color. These paints do get a little bit dirty, so it's important that you know that the brush that's actually on the set of paints is merely for cleaning it off. This is a very bristly brush. You don't want to try to paint with it. It's not going to have a good feel to it. But if any of your colors get dirty throughout this process, all you need to do is dip that bristly brush into the paint and swish it around on the color that needs to be brightened up. This is going to happen a lot. You can see the yellows starting to brighten up. You don't need to keep these paints as clean as if you were using watercolor, but it is a process of continuously making sure they're cleaned off before you try to mix to match your second swatch or your third swatch or your fourth swatch, because it's going to, obviously affect your colors if your paints aren't clean. The other thing that's good to do with these paints is just to get them all a little bit wet. You want to start activating the pigment in them so that when you're ready to use them, you're not getting too much water, you're getting a lot of the color. This is a pretty versatile paint, so you can technically paint with this and really dilute it, but you don't want to do that for this project. Our goal is to match the colors of the magazine swatches, which are very saturated, nice, deep, dark colors. So you don't want this paint to be too transparent so that the white paper shows through and impacts the color that you create. So you can see I've already done 4 specialty colors. I'm going to just maybe do this one, which is a pink. I can tell it's a pink, which would be red and white. Obviously, it's a light version of pink, but it's not a pure pink. There's something else in it. So if I go to create this pink, I know that I'm going to use some red. I know that I'm going to use some white, but I'm probably going to have to change it a little more. So when you're using these paints, you really, really, really want to swish them around. You want to get pigment to be activated, and you really want to just kind of scoop up a nice dollop of whatever color it is you're trying to create and then rinse out your brush between colors. You can't see this, but I'm now going to dip into the white and really get that activated. So I start creating my pink, which I know it's not going to be a pure pink, but I'm going to get it there eventually. And again, we learn by doing. So this is just a process of continuously mixing. When you think you have the color correct, you're going to put it on the scrap piece of paper and hold it up to the swatch to see how it matches, and you're going to change it as you need to. So at this point, I would put a little dot on the swatch I would hold it up. I can already tell by holding this up to the swatch that it's a little bit too dark and it's also a little bit too red. I know just from my years of color theory knowledge that I'm going to need to add a little bit of yellow to that. It's a slight peach undertone. So at this point I'm going to pick up a little more yellow. I'm going to add it to the pink I've already created to try to get that peach action going. And then of course I know it's not light enough, so after I do that, I'm going to add some white to it. The white's the one, since it's so light, that sometimes it really takes some work to get it activated, to get it going. So now all of a sudden you can say I have a lighter pink. It's got a peach undertone. I'm going to put a little dollop on my scrap paper and hold it up to the swatch, and I have gotten it closer to the magazine swatch. Your goal is to keep doing this over and over again and repeating until you can get your color as close as possible to the swatch, knowing that this is also a very forgiving paint. So once you find what you think is the perfect color and you paint it in the section underneath the swatch, I say usually do 2 coats. So I'm going to fill this square, and by the time I fill it, it's probably going to be a little bit dry enough at least for me to pick up a little more pigment and do a second coat. And the reason I would do that is just to really make sure I'm covering the white of the paper. We don't want too much white showing through because that lightness of the paper will actually impact how we see the color in the end. So I'm just going to go through and put a second coat on here so it's nice and saturated. That's pretty darn close to my swatch. I'm going to leave that paint undisturbed in my palette because I also want to just give this a chance to dry. Sometimes when paint dries and the water evaporates from it, its color will change a little, or rather the value of its color. So this might be a little dark right now, but once it dries, I'm going to evaluate it and see if it matches. If it doesn't match completely, I know I've got a little more work to do. Your goal is to start with these top 6 swatches, see how it goes and how close you can get the colors to match the swatches you choose. And if all goes well and you have extra time, you might as well try 6 more on the bottom. To show you my final paper, I do want to just make note that this paint, like we said, it gets pretty messy and you have to kind of clean it off and brighten it up. If your paint gets filled with a whole lot of pigment and it just loses that bright color you're looking for and you can't get it back to normal, like I said, you can clean it off with the bristly brush, but also don't be afraid to work in there with a paper towel and just kind of give it a wipe and remove the top layer of pigment so that you brighten it up again. Hang in there and don't give up. Just keep in mind, this is just a process of trial and error, continuously mixing and remixing and having perseverance and not giving up until your colors as closely match the swatches as possible. Your goal should be to stick with this until you get at least 6 that are awesome, and if you want to try it again, 12 would be even better. This is a process you can continuously do if you're an artist to help keep your eyes refined and to continuously practice your color theory knowledge.